Доброго дня. Дуже рада всіх вітати на цій важливій події, яка присвячена темі боротьби із пропагандою та
dedicated to combating propaganda, as well as ensuring efficient liability for propaganda and perpetration of propaganda. We are waiting for the presentation to be pulled up, and then we shall begin.
Translation.
All right, so we shall begin. My name is Anna Vishnyakova. I am an international criminal law expert, a lawyer, a head of the LinguaLex organization. This event is dedicated to the research that was produced a few months ago. It is called Words That Kill: How Russian Propaganda Shapes Mobilization and Combat Motivation. To those of you who are here in the room, you can pick up a printed copy. It's right here on the chairs. To those of you who are joining online, you can download it on our website. As the access is open, it's in English and in Ukrainian. All right, so let us begin. Propaganda works as the architectural framework of reasonings that legitimizes aggression in the eyes of those who perpetrate it. It removes internal barriers, dehumanizes Ukrainians, and normalizes violence. And this is the key to understanding why propaganda not only persuades, but also facilitates the commission of a crime. It is not the main motivator of this war, but alongside release from prison and money, it changes the moral compass the soldiers rely on to evaluate their own actions. Propaganda is a hot topic in many different forms. However, it is important to remember that it is the law that protects democratic values. Therefore, it is important to not just talk about propaganda, but to ensure that propaganda is treated as a crime. The Criminal Code of Ukraine and the international law provides for several different articles that enshrine different modes of liability. One of them is aiding and abetting aggressive war. It is important to understand that we should ensure liability not only for the talking heads themselves, but also for the individuals who are behind the ideology and the architecture of propaganda itself. The people who work with the Russian military intelligence, Federal Security Service, and the presidential administration. And it is the article for aiding and abetting the aggressive war that can be the mode of liability, because propaganda alongside with drones and missiles destroys us. Because it is the war that came first, and it is the war that preceded the war and full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And seems clear, but for the purposes of criminal provision, we have to carefully collect the evidence. And it is the evidence that has to demonstrate clear linkage between propaganda and violence. In order to gather evidence for criminal proceedings, in collaboration with the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, LinguaLex involved independent social psychology experts to conduct a unique study. We managed to collect data from over 1,000 Russian prisoners of war to identify the relationship between their belief in propaganda narratives and how they perceive the so-called special military operation. The research was conducted right at the detention facilities where the prisoners of war were held. To ensure reliable results, our interdisciplinary team put together a structured two-part paper questionnaire. In the first part, we have outlined the key Russian narratives in Russian using simple words. For example, do you believe that Ukraine has biolabs? Do you believe that Ukraine has Nazis? We had 18 different questions that reflected Russian narratives, right? The second part of the questionnaire allowed us to understand the POW's perception of the special military operation. Do they believe it is legitimized? Would they like to return if they are freed from captivity? One of the interesting questions of the second part was actually related to the dehumanization of Ukrainians. And the results were actually impressive. The findings were impressive. The first question was, of course, the context of their captivity, right? That's the first question that we have to discuss. The context of detention definitely influences how candidly POWs respond. Given the circumstances, individuals may be reluctant to fully express their views or behaviors if they believe it may be viewed negatively by the interviewers. Therefore, you can imagine that the figures in the study should be interpreted as conservative, minimal estimates, and the actual level of Russian soldiers' belief in propaganda, dehumanization of Ukrainians, their support of the special military operation, it is likely to be higher, and the situation is likely to be worse. In other words, the socially desirable responses here are not so much a problem of the method, but an additional signal that even under conditions where respondents may underestimate their responses and the figures, we still see clear patterns, which means that in reality, these patterns may be even stronger. It is important to outline that the study was conducted in accordance with current legal procedures and in strict compliance with the ethical principles of the American Psychological Association, the Geneva Convention provisions, and Ukrainian procedural law, and it was approved by the National Psychological Association of Ukraine. The procedure provided for completely voluntary participation and guaranteed confidentiality. I would also like to highlight here that not everyone participated. A few people refused to participate in the questionnaire. In terms of the requirements that we abided by, we also ensured video recording, and the video recording was done not only to comply with the requirements of the Criminal Procedure Code of Ukraine, because we primarily have conducted the study not as a demonstration or as a reflection of certain study initiatives, but instead to serve as potential evidence in the framework of criminal proceedings, but also we used the video recording to confirm the absence of duress and confirm the authenticity of the responses provided. Now let's move on to the most interesting part, the findings. First and foremost, propaganda does justify aggression. Soldiers who strongly believed in propaganda were 6 times more likely to say that the invasion was right and necessary. This means that propaganda gives people a moral and logical justification for violence. Second finding, propaganda strengthens ideological attachment. The more a person believes in propaganda, the more strongly they identify with the idea of the Russian world. This is usually associated with greater loyalty and willingness to fight or even die for this ideology. Almost half of those who believed most in propaganda spoke of complete ideological fusion. So in order to question their fusion with the Russian world or test their fusion with the Russian world, we marked a scale where we put a circle for the Russian world, and then they had to put themselves, whether they are inside the Russian world or whether they identify as being outside of it or whether they state that they are partially fused. And we have found that the propaganda definitely strengthens the self-identification of an individual as a part of this Russian world. Propaganda dehumanizes Ukrainians. This is one of the most important findings. We have taken a scale. Most people probably have seen it, from a monkey to a human, right? This evolution scale. And can you imagine, even in the detention facilities, the Russian POWs, most of them marked Ukrainians as subhuman, right? And those are people who have been taken as prisoners of war. So it's really hard to imagine what happens with those who are outside of Ukraine right now or those who are fighting on the front lines. Next finding. Propaganda fuels the desire to fight. People who believe more in propaganda narratives were twice as likely to say that they wanted to return to war and fight again, even after being captured. In other words, propaganda helps them to hold on to aggression psychologically. Number 5, propaganda reduces willingness to surrender. The more an individual believes in propaganda, the less willing they are to surrender voluntarily. Even a slight increase in the belief in propaganda reduced the likelihood of surrender. Soldiers who believed Russian propaganda were almost 2 times less likely to surrender than those who believed it to a lesser extent. And of course, as a result, this leads to war lasting longer and perpetuating more violence. Of course, these are just 5 findings, but we could draw different correlations because we have conducted this study to provide findings publicly, but we will also have separate events with scientists in the academia field, and we will provide them more information on the more in-depth correlations, of course. And we also have separated certain correlations that could be included in the materials of criminal proceedings. When it comes to findings, first and foremost, based on this study, we can claim that belief in propaganda definitely legitimizes aggression. The more a soldier believes in military propaganda, the more he or she perceives special military operation as necessary, justified, and legitimate. This shows that propaganda acts as a moral and cognitive basis for aggression, turning acts of invasion into justified actions. Propaganda strengthens combat motivation. Belief in propaganda reduces soldiers' willingness to surrender voluntarily. Even after experiencing the horrors of war, those who have been most strongly influenced by propaganda remain willing to return to the Russian army. This resilience reflects the depths of psychological indoctrination, the ability of propaganda to bind a person to a cause, even when they are confronted with the devastating consequences. And of course, ideological fusion strengthens loyalty. The influence of propaganda creates a strong sense of fusion with the Russian world. This strengthens ideological loyalty and willingness to make radical sacrifices, including participation in combat or self-sacrifice. Greetings. My name is Irina Ftorovich. I am the head of the NGO Socialna Idea, Social Action. We haven't studied propaganda, but we worked with Lingua Lexa for more than a year. In a way, our work correlates. I will tell you how our work correlates and who we are and why it is important to pay attention to the issue of propaganda in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine and in the context of working towards ensuring justice and preparing for international justice mechanisms. We are a small team of experts, primarily, and the entire time of our work, we worked with the topics of inequality, discrimination, hate crimes, analyzing relevant legislation, training law enforcement officers. And it seems like we have nothing to do with war and propaganda, right? But if we carefully interpret what war crimes and international crimes mean and look at historically how they have developed and how they have been prosecuted, and if we look in the context of the words that we have become so familiar with over the course of the past 4 years, of course, we will learn that no international crime is possible without proving the motive of hatred, essentially, which is why we've joined the 5 a.m. coalition since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We've started working together with the civil society as well as the government agencies to talk about the necessity to document the hatred, the intent of hatred in the entire scope of evidence that's being collected, because if Ukraine is ever to prove on the international level that what is currently happening, what is being perpetrated by the Russian war criminals are not isolated crimes, but are a system of crimes perpetrated as a crime of genocide, as a crime of prosecution, then we have to collect this data. We have to work towards evaluating and analyzing narratives, including propaganda narratives. And this is a tremendous undertaking that has to strengthen what is currently being done by the law enforcement officers in the field when they collect data on every crime being perpetrated separately. What we've done over the past 4 years is we looked into the data that's being collected by the NGOs that make up the 5 a.m. coalition. So we've looked over all of these data, all this information in order to identify whether the individuals documenting data in the field actually pay attention to the intent, whether they collect that information. We've seen some gaps, which is why our work was dedicated towards improving the checklist that is being used to collect the data in order to document these patterns better, in order to reflect them better, because in separate cases we do see that happen. We've conducted multiple training events. We worked together with the Office of the Prosecutor General, talking to them about how it is very important that Ukraine is trying to prosecute individual crimes right now, but even at the national level, we have to work systematically in order to make sure that each separate case that's being prosecuted, if it had the motive of hatred, it has to be documented, because they will later make up a larger puzzle when Ukraine will be talking about crime of persecution and be trying to prove it. So we have developed training. We are ready to join this work later on, because in our opinion, this idea of motive of hatred. It's a very important component of ensuring liability for crime of persecution and crime of genocide. And I hope that we will have a strong case. Of course, I wish it hadn't happened the way it did. However, working under the current circumstances, we have to take into account what is currently taking place in the informational field. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you. Please, could you show your wonderful slides? Yeah, okay, then we'll skip that. Now, I do suggest we talk about the legal component of all of this. I always say that when propaganda reaches the moon, the law is still crawling down on the ground. The law is always very conservative, and it is unable to encompass everything that's happening in terms of propaganda. And it is quite unfortunate. Of course, we shouldn't say that the law isn't working. No, it just means that the law should be developed based on what is and involving current technology. Because when the propaganda is relying on artificial intelligence at this point, the law is lagging behind because a lot of things are done manually, which is why our team is involved in new technological developments and new projects. We are currently working on a very interesting tool based on the artificial intelligence that will allow us to filter through the propaganda narratives to actually separate the ones relevant in terms of criminal proceedings from those that are non-relevant for the investigators, which is why I always advocate that we should work effectively with current technology and rely on artificial intelligence. The second domain is that we shouldn't focus on journalists or politicians alone, because propaganda is much more widespread. It is everywhere. It is in the music. Our organization has conducted an interesting study based on the propaganda in music. We even conducted a study on video games. We've studied how propaganda is being spread through video games. In sports, right? We just saw the Olympic Games. In science, in education, propaganda is everywhere, which is why we should perceive propaganda through a wider lens and not concentrate on the talking heads only that are looking at us from the TV screen and saying things that are unimaginable to other human beings. It's important to ensure liability for perpetrators and for organizers. Of course, the current legislation ensures a range of different modes of liability through a range of articles. However, the jurisprudence still lags behind. In the times of Nuremberg and Rwanda, Ukraine is currently the trailblazer that not only can, but should develop the legal framework and develop the case law to demonstrate to the entire world that we should not ignore propaganda. Because if we look at the number of cases in the global jurisprudence that pertain to propaganda, they're minimal, they are very fragmentary, and they are separate from the current reality. So it's important for us to work with the topic of propaganda, to build wider unified criminal proceedings that would encompass different modes of liability, different elements that would include different levels of perpetrators, not only those that are on the screen, but also those behind the curtain. So it's important for us to use all of the opportunities that we have, not only the article in the Ukrainian criminal code on the propaganda for the incitement of war, because those exist in more than 30 other countries as well, but it's also very important for us to work with the principle of universal jurisdiction in order to ensure liability for propagandists and in order to track them and to track their assets abroad, and to limit their opportunities abroad as well. I'm delighted to see that there are organizations who are dedicated to fighting and documenting international crimes, including crime of persecution. And of course, we definitely should track this topic of hatred, this motive of hatred. And of course, the idea of aiding and abetting the aggressive war. The Rome Statute currently limits the framework of who can be held liable for the aggressive war. It is a higher military and political command. However, Ukraine should not copy-paste that blindly. Of course, it's important to say that currently we do not have the case of aggression with the International Criminal Court because it is legally impossible, as you probably know, and we truly hope that we'll have a special tribunal established. And there we will be able to talk about the crime of aiding and abetting aggressive war through a wider scope than it is envisaged by the Rome Statute. So it is very important to look at the role of propaganda in what is currently happening right now, in what has started happening in the East. And it is very important to consider propaganda just as much of weapon as missiles and drones. And it is important to ensure liability for the people who have developed propaganda, who are behind the architectural propaganda. Now we can move on to questions. First and foremost, we'll give the floor for questions to the people present here offline, and then we'll give the floor to people online. Colleagues? Greetings. Yuri Melnik, Selfish Ubuntu, thanks. First and foremost, pertaining to the methodology and to your conclusion that the prisoners of war are trying to create a better image in the eyes of the interviewers, which is why the findings are minimal. I do have the opposite assumption. If they are the Russian citizens, and eventually they do plan to get home, which is why they have to state what is being expected of them when they return, which means that filling out the questionnaire, they need to give you the answers that are expected of them by the Russian government. Have you taken that into consideration? That's question number one. Or statement number one. And statement number two, you have not included non-Russian citizens who were taken POWs in your questionnaire, primarily citizens of African countries. It would be interesting to learn what they are fighting for. They're not fighting just for money, right? Often they're also victims of Russian propaganda. Have you included them? Thank you so much for your question. I will answer right away. Look. It is because of this specifically that we involved a social psychologist, because if it was just a legal expert who came together and conducted this study, we would have a very different study. Of course, we have taken that into account. I have personally spoken to POWs. I had an opportunity to do that. And the framework of thinking is quite wide, right? They knew it was fully confidential. Not all of them wanted to go back home after the end of their detention. But when we conducted the study, we have taken that into account, that factor, because of the assistance of our social psychologists. In terms of the non-Russian citizens, if you look in the study, you will see that the data is actually compiled when the person ends up taken as a prisoner of war. We have taken information on their nationality, on their origin. We cannot highlight all of the information, but we have added statistical data on the religious background to see who the propaganda impacts most, the Christians, the Muslims, the atheists. This is also a very important lens to look at the study through, but you can see all that information in the study itself. Greetings. My name is Petro Kalina. I'm a military diplomat, a colonel, a retired colonel of the Ukrainian General Staff. I do have a question. Do you agree with the statement that the word may not only kill, but may also save a life? Especially Ukrainian identity, if it is the element of the so-called soft power in the framework of the security guarantees for Ukraine. Under this hybrid world war that is currently taking place, perpetrated by the aggressor state, what do I mean? The Russians have in their passports stated that they are from the Russian Federation. The English-speaking society calls them Russian Federation. The Chinese calls them Elusu Limba. The Latvia calls them Krieria Federacija. So maybe it is important for Ukrainians to start calling them properly in Ukrainian, the aggressor state, RF. RF forces. Because the study of the Doctor of Sciences of Ukraine has also proved that the RF citizens are Russists. Thank you. This is an important question. 3 things. The first statement, we have definitely conducted this research, but it is the first step. And based on that, we can conduct many follow-up studies, for example, to study how can Ukrainians possibly convince other audiences based on what the RF citizens believe in. We can build our own narratives. Second thing, I am a lawyer. My second degree is in philosophy, but unfortunately for myself, I am a law expert rather than a philosophy expert. But I do understand the importance of cognitive sciences, which is why, based on our organization, we are currently trying to build a hub of sorts where we invite specialists across different fields to join, specialists who work with propaganda, but not in the framework of law itself, because it is definitely important to perceive it through the framework of philosophy, because my organization also participates in investigations. So when we look at the structure of the Russian propaganda, it is so much worse than we can even imagine, because we're currently trying to map it out and we see who is behind it ideologically, right? In Ukraine, we have this perception that it is Dugin, for example, and a few other people. Everything is a lot worse. Trust me, the people who they are showing us in media are not the people truly behind it. And when you try to unwind this huge ball of yarn, you see philosophers, you see political experts, political scientists, and this propaganda hasn't been developed in 2014 or 2010. No, it goes way back to the Soviet Union. And it's something that reverses over the different cycles. It is this beast that grew right alongside us. And number 3, how can we call them? How should we call them? When we have conducted our first study, it pertained to the incitement to genocide. And I had a question of how do we spell Russian Federation, from capital letters or lowercase letters, right? And then I was involved in the translation of international legal acts into Ukrainian. I was participating in the meeting of linguists who were discussing the spelling. And they said that the Russian Federation has to be spelled with capital letters because it has been approved, and this is something for the professionals to decide. We have put an asterisk, and we have put it underneath in the note that we understand the intent, but we spell Russian Federation with capital letters due to the current legislation. I'm not an expert as a linguist, so I cannot say how we should call Russian Federation, but as a person, I completely agree with you. We should use something else. Dmytro Durov, a journalist. Could you please tell us, what is propaganda? Have you studied what impacts Russian service members, army newspapers, news shows, entertainment shows? Do you have names in your study of people who should be held liable? And I will give you a very short answer. Unfortunately, no. And this is the disadvantage of the study, the gap. How did we come up with an idea to study this topic? We had this huge case on artists. 2 years ago, we have come to a conclusion that we have to study propaganda in the music. A prosecutor of the Vinnytsia Oblast prosecutor's office approached me and showed me a letter to Spotify and YouTube with a list of songs that are publicly available and that incite genocide. So requesting for YouTube to block these accounts and these people. That's when we started to work on these cases. And we had an opportunity to talk to prisoners of war, to ask them how music impacted them. And the things that we learned was not something we could have learned from OSINT, because they have downloaded the songs onto their phones that they used to listen to when they went on assaults. So studying the sources of propaganda is extremely important, but it was not within the scope of this specific study, because we have conducted this study not for educational purposes, not for public discussion purposes. We have conducted this study specifically for criminal proceeding purposes, but I do implore all of you working with the topic of Russian propaganda to study specifically what and how impacts the minds of the people. But once again, this specific study did not have it within the scope of it to find specific sources of propaganda. Thank you. Greetings, coordinational staff for the treatment of prisoners. So at the beginning of your presentation, you have identified the key Russian narratives that were used in the propaganda at the beginning of your presentation. And so propaganda as such, or its perception, impacts the willingness to surrender, right? Have you considered, or what do you think, whether there are certain narratives that impact the willingness to surrender to a higher extent or a lesser extent? Thank you. We have had the possibility to analyze all of these narratives separately, and it was quite interesting for us to see which narratives impacted the POWs the most. And of course, those are primarily the anti-Western narratives, which may be of interest for our international colleagues, that the Russian POWs truly believe that they're fighting not Ukraine, but NATO. They're fighting American soldiers. They're fighting European soldiers on the Ukrainian soil. And this is the primary group of narratives that impacts their thinking. But our study, in my opinion, as a lawyer who is very removed from numbers and statistics, the actual study looks as a huge table with correlations and links. We have partners with Kyiv School of Economics, with their Department of Social Psychology, and we have a phenomenal social psychologist, Jace Adam Troyan, who is a PhD in social psychology, and we're incredibly grateful to him. So he can link all of these items. Because if we were to publish all of the correlations, the study would be much larger and much more extensive, but if there would be separate requests, we're definitely willing to look into it. Thank you. There are no more questions in the audience? A comment? All right. Could we please give the floor to people online for them to ask questions? And if they have no more questions, then we'll give you the floor for the comment, okay? If there are any more questions online, you can raise your hand. We have an online moderator who would be able to help us. All right, we have no more questions online, please. You have said, you have mentioned Russian world, right? So it's important to pronounce it properly with the double S as a reference to Nazi ideology. Thank you for your comment. If you have no more questions, thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you for paying attention to this topic, and our organization definitely thanks all of you for joining, and we are open for cooperation. We are open to further studying the topic of propaganda, and we believe that it is important to conduct multidisciplinary investigations and not just limit this topic to jurisprudence, but instead to have the law be a component of this research, because law is the shield that protects us. Thank you all so much.